The Norwegian Method.
I'm Olav Alexander Boo, peak human performance developer, coach to Kristian Blumenfeld and Gustav.
I'm Dr. David Lippman, a health and human performance specialist, and welcome to the Norwegian Method podcast.
The Norwegian Method.
Welcome back to the Norwegian Method podcast, and joining me today, as often is the case, Olav. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, David.
And today we're going to talk about aerodynamics. So we got two podcasts in a row that'll come out, and the first podcast will talk about aerodynamics strictly, and the second one we'll start talking about how those aerodynamics get traded off against things like metabolics and power and all these sort of things. So today is going to be more about aerodynamics, and that will dovetail really well into our next podcast where we start to balance things out, probably more with respect to triathlon. This one's probably going to be, triathlon specific, but certainly have some more applications across the cycling. And then the second one maybe a little bit less so. So I guess with that as the background, aerodynamics is not something I know a lot about personally, so this is a real treat for me. So thank you. But what I wanted to start with is, where does a triathlete start? So they've never had an aero setup before. Maybe they've raced, Olympic distance or something like this. Maybe they haven't raced Olympic distance. They, just want to do an Ironman. They've ridden a bike before, but where do you start from an aero perspective? Do you just sort of get a couple of, you get some aero bars and then start from there, or is there something more to it?
Yeah. The question is, where do we want to set the level? What level do we start from?
Let's start with somebody who's let's take Kristian. All right, let's take Kristian from when he was doing only Olympic distance. Right, probably didn't ride any real time in aero. So how does he then go from no real time in aero into an aerodynamically, I guess let's call it optimized setup?
Okay. Because if we wanted to start before, then obviously, like if you're talking about aero bars and he's kind of just getting a pair of aero bars or clip-ons and these kind of things, I would say that's if you already have a bike and a road bike or anything like this, getting clip-on aero bars is the first part. Is actually you could say that the first part really of riding aero is about finding a position and getting comfortable riding aero on your bike. That's the first and very often the most important thing you could say. Because you can be very aero on a bike, but it doesn't mean you're stable, and you start wasting a lot of energy on the bike as well. So being stable is important. Now, do we want to focus as a case, for example, purely from basic Kristian going from Olympic to aero, like for example in Cozumel, or
let's do that, because I think people love to hear about the elites, of course, and I think there is a trickle down here, which is there are principles that will apply more broadly. Now, the specifics won't apply, right? Like no one is Kristian except Kristian, but broadly there are some learnings here, particularly for Kristian, because unlike Gustav, who's probably from a pure cycling perspective a bit more, I guess, more cyclists would look at Gustav and go, that looks like a cyclist than Kristian right now, regardless of watts and speeds. They would certainly look at Gustav and say, okay, he's in a traditionally good cycling position, whereas Kristian's position, particularly earlier in his career, maybe now it's a little bit more traditional, but earlier in the piece, he was a lot more vertical than a lot of people are when it comes to aero. So I think that'd be really interesting for people to hear about.
When we started, we started looking at aero, I think this must have been in 2017, more in detail. And the reason for that is because Kristian and Gustav and Kasper started to do more long course racing, or basically 70.3 races. And at that time, they really didn't have any bike sponsors or anything like this. They had maybe gotten a bike from the local dealer that they had. I remember Gustav had a Felt DA 1 at that time, if I'm not mistaken. Kristian, I think, and Kasper, both of them were... I don't think that they had an aero bike at that time, long time ago. Anyway, they got their triathlon bikes, and one of the things we started to incorporate is something called virtual elevation. And this is something that when people start to get introduced to aero, virtual elevation is like a well-documented technique, which was developed by or proposed by Robert Chung. So one of what you really do there is that you just use your power meter and you use the speed from let's say from a speed sensor. You don't really want to use a GPS speed. You want to have a speed sensor simply because the GPS is a little bit too inaccurate for the use we have here. GPS is super accurate when you have long distances and all these kind of things, but basically for out and back and everything like this, where we are talking about something that ideally is at least 2 decimal correct, or let's say reproducible, then the GPS, I would say, is too inaccurate. Now, here in this case, also you will hear that I will use the word speed quite a lot, simply because basically what you actually also get in here is lateral oscillations. When your front wheel sensor compared to basically just using the distance from A to B and a stopwatch, you actually have, it's important that you actually get in the nuances, because some people will be really good at straight lining in aero position. Other people have a little bit more variation, and you might also have gusts and other things that throw you off a little bit, which basically will still maintain the same speed or even higher speed, but you might see that the time between two distances gets a little bit slower because the total distance you're rolling out is longer. But what you really do, what you are not able to capture with pure virtual elevation necessarily, unless you do a lot of back and out, so you average it out rather, is that there are, for example, changes in surface will artificially change the speed to power ratio for you, given that you have the same position. Other things that also will influence basically the speed to power ratio is suddenly if you get a headwind gust, for example, tailwind gusts and so on, can also influence the time that you use between two. But then you say that if you do enough out and back, you will normally be able to average this out. One of the things I was involved at that time, I were involved in a couple of different aerometer projects, and we had also developed some in-house aerometers as well. But the challenge with that, or you can say that what it only does for you in reality, when you look at these aerometers that are there today, is that they only compensate really for basically wind speed and wind direction. That's basically two things it only really compensates for. It's still not really let's say a true CDA or aero meter. That we only have Body Rocket. Body Rocket is actually the only company in the world that actually do that. And the way they do it is the same way in a wind tunnel, and that is that you basically have, in a wind tunnel, you have a force stance. You measure the forces that are acting on the bike and the rider. And this is effectively what Body Rocket have done, and the reason why I decided to engage with them. That was because what they did is that they took the rider, and you isolate the rider from the bike by basically putting now aero sensors in, or let's say sensors that are used for direct drag force measurement in the pedals, in the seats, and in the cockpit, which basically effectively measures all forces that are acting on the rider. Almost like you had a vertical instead of a horizontal scale and you're stepping on it, you have now a vertical scale that is measuring how much force is acting on you in this direction. And this means that you can take the step away from virtual elevation and go like to direct drag force measurements. But that's another story. Moving forward, one thing that you also don't know when you do virtual elevation is how sustainable is your position, for example. You can get a feel of it, and it's good to be out in the field and do practice back and forth a little bit, because you get a practical feel with basically how stable are you in the position. So for example, when you're riding out and then you have a turnaround point, for example, are you still able to, say you have a little bit of space there, but are you actually able to stay in your air position when you do that? If it's like really wobbly and you're a little bit afraid of getting out of position, getting into your position and really getting into position before you are up to speed, that's normally an indicator of that you might have picked a too unstable or non-sustainable position. The second thing that you don't get really feedback on with, or you get only partial feedback on with virtual elevation, is that you don't understand necessarily how robust your aerodynamics are, because you can have a lot of fluctuations, but again, they average out. While when you have a direct drag force measurements, this is exactly where you can see, okay, here we have a lot of oscillations indicating that it's not a very robust position. The peaks are really good when you're really able to get there, but too often there is something causing instability in the aerodynamic measurements or the force measurements.
And so just to double click here for people who may not be following, in effect, if I watched you guys do some aero testing, you were using your force transducers, right, at that stage. So you were looking at direct drag measurement. But if you weren't, and you were doing virtual elevation in that context, you were riding around an athletics track. So your rolling resistance is the same. right? You are rolling around in circles and it's relatively sheltered, so the wind isn't as big a deal. So if we remove those two factors, now all of a sudden the two things that are affecting you're measuring speed and you're measuring power. So the difference there, or one of the factors that's impacting the power to speed conversion, is your CDA, which is effectively how you calculate that, which is a key component of drag, which is what we're talking about. Whereas with these direct drag measurements, we aren't estimating that over a period of time. We are physically measuring it instantaneously or minute by minute or something like this. So you can see, hey, these fluctuations, those are real, versus we've averaged those out because we're having to use an average based on the way that we're calculating this, and we're estimating it rather than measuring it.
Yeah, and in this case also we are talking about even sub-second measurements, even where you can go to very high resolutions if you want to do that. And that's also one of the things that actually not too many people think about as well, that when you go into a wind tunnel, because if you're also in a wind tunnel and you do measurements, actually you need to have a high resolution there as well, because sometimes what is invisible to you is actually how the air is behaving over your body. Yep. And that's the thing that you could, of course, use advanced imaging techniques and so on to get a better understanding for. But in most cases, you don't do that. And you, again, if you're basically looking at the two, let's say, poor resolution, you might actually not capture, and you end up averaging out basically something that really is not stable at all either. So then talking about, for example, how air is behaving over the body, and actually for sometimes air can take quite some time to stabilize before you get the true readings as well, even in a wind tunnel. But nevertheless, that's getting into the details. I think
2017 you started measuring CDA. Now you're measuring direct drag forces, but you had no triathlon bikes. Then all of a sudden you got given a couple of bikes by a lovely bike shop, or the boys bought them, or whatever. How did you? I guess you now have a way to quantify aero. So how did you start off? You put them in the aero bars and said, okay, let's measure this, and then let's start playing with the position.
Yes, that you can effectively say. They basically went around, let's say, making adjustments on the bikes and these kind of things, and then we started to quantify the aerodynamics for them. We even went to velodrome, where we did testing on velodrome as well to quantify the CDA. But what you don't know when you do that is basically whether this is, okay, what does this look like from a metabolic perspective? And that's where we, again, when we had figured out a couple of positions that we thought were quite interesting, this is when we went back into the lab, and then we basically played around a little bit with those situations, or let's say positions, and where we measured now the oxygen uptake, for example, with the VO2 master, to basically understand what is the oxygen cost of these different positions. That does not necessarily then say that this is how it is forever after. It is basically still only a snapshot of basically, okay, this is what it looks like today. But then we also know that this is something that is trainable. So in the same way that everything else is trainable, this is also something where you should train yourself into a better and better position. And you can then say, well, this position is better, so I'm just going to go with the most aggressive position and just become good at that. But what you don't know is that, for example, if you then go with a more robust position aerodynamically, and then rather change into more aerodynamic position as you basically train more and more towards it, you might actually end up with a different position than what you thought was from the get-go the best position for you. So for us, it was really where we used virtual elevation. So leading into Tokyo Olympics, we used virtual elevation, advanced virtual elevation, by using pitot tube systems to quantify the effects, so let's say both the environmental effects better as well. And then combining that with sessions where we did sensitivity analysis of aerodynamics out in the field of velodrome, and where we did metabolic sensitivity analysis inside the lab to basically see, okay, what's happening between these two positions that are there. Then fast forward after the Olympics, this is of course when we started to use more of the body rocker system and direct drag force measurements for them. But again, the thing is that you still want to, and you actually see that there are pictures online of Kristian, for example, or Gustav in wind tunnel, where we have the VO2 master on as well, to basically start to get already there, map out some things that are there, let's say in terms of finding this aero metabolism balance. Most of the time, it is an iterative process where you want to have those sessions where you look at it and you look at, okay, what does it look like from an aerodynamic perspective? You lock it in. then you have to just do some training sessions. And then very often it's enough with 1 to 2 weeks of riding in that position. You get a feel for it. You make a new change to the position, and at some point you are at the point where you feel, okay, this is a really good. Now I don't know what more I really want to do changing it. Then it becomes more of a, let's say, either where you decide to do some small changes because of a specific race and the race course itself, or let's say environmental conditions, if you know it's going to be strong winds, light winds, whatever. And then you also then at that time also need aerodynamic measurements to, like body rocket system, to understand sometimes the differences between different let's say suits, changes that we're making to the suits and so on, because you can't feel it. It's really, really hard to feel it. And also when we do aerodynamic testing, you don't do it over 180k. You do it normally over much shorter distances. And that means that it's also hard to know really, was this basically out and back 1 second or 2 seconds faster because of aerodynamics, or was it the wind that actually played a trick here, for example, or the things that are there. And worst case, you're even on a road where there are cars passing by as well, which also has an influence on it. And in these cases, this is where you need to have measurements on your bike now to quantify it. But for Kristian, this is also one of the things where we see basically that Gustav have normally a very, very good feel. This is, as I call it, more of a Gustav talent than Kristian talent. And where Gustav have a really good talent for feeling his position on the bike. So he very often listens to or feels how the air is behaving over his body. Kristian is more like the machine where you put it into position and either it works or it doesn't work a little bit, and you need to play around a little bit. But so he is more dependent on the numbers. But you will see Gustav normally gets closer to an ideal number or like an ideal setup without having almost instruments, while Kristian needs instruments for sure. But at some point, both need instruments anyway when you want to start to play around with helmets. Suits, other things that are influencing the aerodynamics. And this is also an iterative process. It's not like one helmet is the best. It will also depend on the suit, especially advanced suits or so. So the takeaway to bring it down more to amateur level, or basically within the constraints people have, is that on the one side you want to have an aerometer on your bike. So the body rocket system obviously is the way to go forward. It's the only direct drag force system that is on the market. And then when you have that, you typically will start using, for example, so you have your high intensity sessions, you have your medium intensity sessions, but the medium to low intensity sessions when you're out riding, like put in focus areas in your training where you say, okay, for the next, in this 30-minute interval or 20-minute interval or something like that, say that you were riding LT1, you said, okay, I'm going to focus on this interval, I'm going to focus on this aero task. The next one, I'm going to focus on this aero task. In the next one, we're going to change, for example, the cockpit by 1 centimeter lower or higher or something like this. And then you look at it. But what's important to notice at the same time is that one thing that the aerometers won't necessarily capture very well, and that is sometimes the robustness of the position as well. It's super important to actually be, and this can take some time to develop, but actually be honest with yourself. Is like, do I feel comfortable in this position? Is this almost like position just riding? Yeah.
Is this a 30-minute or a 180-kilometer position?
Exactly. And that's a massive difference, because it's not only talking about the 180k position, it's talking about the 180k position that allows you to actually run off the bike really well afterwards too. So it's easy sometimes to just think, oh, we're looking at the numbers here, I'm going to save 2 minutes 40 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever from this position if I do that. Probably I should go with that because I'm not that good of a runner or something like this, or I want to stay with this group of athletes. But the problem with it is that, yeah, maybe you did it on the bike, but you got penalized so heavily on the run afterwards that it's not sustainable. Or worst case, if it even is worse, and that is that you actually end up being able to stay with your group for 100k or 130k, but you really start to suffer a lot and you need to move more around on your bike and so on. But that's the comfort aspect of it. Then we also have another aspect of it, which is quite important. And this is something that, for example, in America's Cup, one is quite obsessing over. And that is that you can go for peak aero or peak, in this case, hydro, for example, hydrodynamics, meaning basically that you optimize for whatever that gives you the very, very best aerodynamic or hydrodynamic properties of your foils and wings and so on. The problem with that is that racing outside is inherently heterogeneous, meaning that wind is changing in strength, direction. There are other things that are influencing this as well. And on top of that, you also need to you have to be aware of your surroundings. So you need to move maybe your head a little bit and other things. Robustness actually comes from finding that optimal aerodynamics that allow you actually to move around on your bike naturally with your head and the body, but with minimal influence on your aerodynamics. The moment you find a very, very oh, this is a fantastic position, but the slightest movement to your body, either where you shuffle on the seat, or you start moving your head, or you change your grip a little bit on the bike there, that's not sustainable at all. Like it will maybe be like a bragging number from the wind tunnel or something like this, but it's definitely not the position that's going to make you the fastest out in the field. The position going to make you the fastest out in the field is actually not a position where you have to be really conscious about whether you hold your hand exactly like this or something like that. It's a position that allows you to move around a little bit with your hands, with your head, and with your body without with minimal aero penalty, to the point where it almost doesn't really matter whether you move a little bit like this or that. And you'll actually find that this is also actually becomes your fastest position in racing as well, and the most reproducible position actually on a bike. When you get off your bike, one thing we see in wind tunnels very often, if you really focus, because the cheat trick you have in a wind tunnel is that you go on the bike there, maybe you do a run-in and something like this, but then you lock in the position at some point. So you get an outline in front of you. So actually in the Aero tunnel, most of the modern Aero tunnels today, wind tunnels today, they actually have a screen just in front of your bike. So you can actually see, okay, I have to move my head a little bit back there. I have to move like this. There, okay, now I'm inside a position here. It doesn't mean that that's the position you will go by. If you actually turn off the screen and you said, athlete, go back on the bike now, find your position again, you will see that basically this is probably changing a little bit all the time there. This is the thing that you are not able to capture, or very often is underlooked at basically in a wind tunnel, but you naturally get out in the field. And the interesting thing is that, for example, when we did some aero testing leading into the Olympics, for example, up in Sierra Nevada, or it was also into the World Championship, also when we were up in Sierra Nevada, for example, going around on the track there. You don't have a screen, you don't have an outline. So what we do normally is that we do a 20 to 30 minute warm-up where they just like you would do, not naturally, and for two reasons. One is to start to get more of a natural biomechanics or pedaling pattern. And the second part is that you actually start moving around on the back and forth on the bike until it actually stabilizes. The interesting thing is that when we did this from day to day, the variations in CDA was on the third decimal order difference in the position. No screen, no nothing, basically just getting into the same reference position again naturally by riding around there. And it's a naturally self-selected position they have. Wind tunnel, this is going to cost you a lot of money simply because half an hour is too costly for you. But the good thing when you have like Aerometer or the body rocket system is that nobody's charging you by the hour. You can just go out and you do the testing and you do the warm-up like you would do with an LT2 session. You would normally have a warm-up, or LT1 session, you do your warm-up and these kind of things. And you use that warm-up to get into position, and then you do a reference run from that, and you'll see that this stays very consistently, even from, let's say, internally in a session. Basically, if you do a reference run first and fifth round, for example, and then you go back again, and then, for example, 8th round, you do another reference, you see this is very, very stable on the third decimal. And the same thing also from day to day, you see that it's extremely very stable as well, independently actually of weather changes and other things too. So key takeaway is don't over focus on finding the aero position that gives you the lowest CDA, because it's not going to be the fastest position for you. In racing like Ironman and other things, the fastest position you're going to find is obviously a position that has a low CDA, but where you actually also can then start playing around with moving your head a little bit, shuffling a little bit back and forward. And when you come back from that lap, whether you analyze it yourself or it's your coach, you basically the coach would basically say to you, hey, there is virtually no difference. That's the position you want to have.
The Norwegian method.
The reason why I use Morten with the boys is because it reduces the GI stress. And the reason why it reduces the GI stress is basically because carbohydrates are packed in a hydrogel. And why that is important again is because if you can then take more carbohydrates per time, it means basically also you can train faster or race faster, which ultimately is the goal in our sport.
To benefit from the one-time code and get 20% off your next purchase on Morten.com, simply enter the code TNMS1 at checkout. The code is applicable once per customer on all products except the Morten bicarb system, valid until the 31st of December 2025.
The Norwegian method.
It strikes me as an 80-20 thing. Like, you need to get roughly 80% of the aero benefits that allow you to then shift around in that position, because you're going to feel like what is comfortable today is going to be different after a long run, is going to be different after a heavy swim session, because you're going to feel different muscularly, tightnesses, all these things. So you want to find a position that is roughly reproducible, roughly comfortable regardless, because even after taper, it's going to feel different. So you want to be able to refine that position as often as possible within a range of then a similar CDA. So that is making a lot of sense to me. Hopefully it's making a lot of sense to the listeners as well.
And just to reinforce it again, going back to the America's Cup example, that's what you do even in billion-dollar teams as well. When you are $100 million dollar teams as well, this is basically what you do there as well. We know today that basically going for peak aerodynamics is not what is going to work. Cut it basically out in the field. Like even wind turbines, this was an extremely costly learning. Like in the early days of wind turbines, was that the blades actually there, we went with something that is called like a NACA 5-digit profile, which is almost like it's normally a laminar flow profile. And laminar flow is really what you like. If you categorize flow, we can normally categorize it in basically what we call laminar flow, turbulent flow, and basically separation bubbles, which is the worst. So laminar is the best, turbulent is the second best, and separation bubble is what you don't want to have at all. That's where you have the vortexes and everything, big eddies and so on, that creates a lot of drag. And that's what you want to reduce to an absolute minimum. The difference between laminar flow and turbulent flow is actually not that big of a difference, really. A little bit, but not much, if you just look for peak aerodynamics. But where it makes a big difference is that laminar flow is so sensitive to impurities and other things like this that it very often ends up going into turbulent flow, but basically in a way that it becomes more uncontrollable and you end up with separation bubbles. So actually on wind turbines when we went with the 5-digit NACA profiles, that looks super, like wind tunnel testing and everything, like, wow, this is really good. Simulation, super good. Went out in the field, installed this wind turbines, and then after just one day, they underperform so heavily just because of bugs that get stuck to the leading edge of the wind turbine. 20% reduction in basically performance over what was estimated with them. Where basically the industry advanced from there is exactly they understood that we need actually profile that actually is more robust, that actually can handle more impurities, changes, and this kind of thing, and then ended up with actually now performance that was on par with what was done in simulations and wind tunnels. And that's the same thing here. Imagine air doesn't come stably onto you like it does in a wind tunnel. It's basically coming all over the place simply because in a wind tunnel, you're also locked on a force stand. Out, you will be riding a little bit like this from stroke to stroke, pedal stroke to pedal stroke on your bike. That's one. Things are happening around. You need to check, am I basically keeping my distance? Where's the corner? Are there something in the road? So you will naturally move a little bit around. And this is basically what's gonna, let's say, contaminate your position a little bit. And that's why you need a very robust position that allows you to naturally do this. It's almost like you should go to the wind tunnel if you really want to use a wind tunnel and just say, hey, I want to move around a little bit on my bike naturally, and we just have to compare it from run to run like that. And then say, yeah, but that's hard to really compare it, really, whether this is the same run as the previous run, because do we know that you really moved around in the same way? Well, that's how reality is. Yeah. That's how reality is, yeah.
Yeah, it strikes me as something a lecturer of mine once said to me with respect to some of the stuff we did, which was the enemy of good is better. So maybe you need a good position, not the best position in this context. So just thinking about wind tunnel use then, it kind of strikes me as you might want to arrive with a good idea of what's going on, test, go away, train a couple of positions, and then come back and retest to try and really understand, is this sustainable from can I actually handle it physically? Can I ride a long time in that? So maybe spend a month, 2 months training that, then come back to the wind tunnel and work out, are we still right? Is that fair to say, or is there a better way to do it?
No, you can say that we'll touch on something quite that where also a little bit this is going to head as well, because we haven't seen peak aero in Ironman yet. Basically, the times will start to become faster in Ironman moving forward, but not because the power is going to increase anymore now. Because on the physiological side, there we actually are closer to probably peak human performance than we are on the aero side currently, and that is rooted in simply looking at the specialist sports, where you basically see that Ironman athletes actually came. You had the time trial, the 1 hour record, and basically the CDA that set a benchmark for where the CDA was, like the boardman position, the Superman position, the praying mantis position, Graham Mowbray, and so on. But the thing is that what happened was that the Ironman athletes started actually to come down, and actually got comparable numbers as basically pure time trialists on a velodrome did, and even maybe surpassed them a little bit in performance, which really doesn't make sense, because these guys are just going, they are perfecting, staying straight lining. They have a line telling them exactly where they are. They don't have to really move their head, anything like this. So they can go closer to let's say, a more sensitive and optimal, or let's say sensitive and peak aero position than what you can do out in the field. But Ironman athletes came very close to it, because simply we were allowed to play more with the position, go beyond a little bit the rules of UCI and so on. But then suddenly what happened was that people say, hey, come on, UCI changed the rules. So the records for Boardman and O'Bray and so on got basically removed and so on. So they still stood as the outright unofficial records, but the UCI rules basically set it back a little bit to where it was before that. But then the guys came close to that, and they even set new ones that were faster than that. And at some point they saw that, hey, maybe we can even now within the new UCI rules beat the outright records that were here. And suddenly you saw people went beyond that. The reason for that was not necessarily because the power output was so much greater than it had been in the past. Surely, of course, you had Philip Ogana that just put out big power, big guy, put a lot of big power, so big power out as well. But then you also had other athletes, like for example Victor Campenarts, that is a small guy, had much lower power, went to altitude to take benefit of basically the lower air density, and also went very close to the outright record too. But the big change that came from suddenly the CDA went down another step. And today, the best CDAs we see from let's say from not well, even from big guys in time trialing is around 0, let's say low, let's say high 0.18, low 0.18, 0.19. While the small guys are actually going beyond, or even lower, below even 0.17, between 0.16, 0.17. And that's a huge gap again for the Ironman athletes to get closer to. And you can imagine if you change, for example, the CDA of an elite Ironman athlete that sits around, let's say 0.20 or 0.21, and you bring that down to 0.18, for example. So you go there, and then you can say, yeah, but how would that be possible? Well, that is by really starting to look more into the aerodynamics again, finding that more the aerodynamic position, but you also start to need to train much more deliberately to be able to bring it down and run fast off the bike as well. You don't hear so many people talking about today as 10 years ago that, oh, you really need to practice your brick session because your hips and legs are going to hurt so bad when you run off the bike. That's not a big problem for people anymore today. It's almost like a forgotten problem. Most people are good at this, and it's really not hurting them at all, and they know a little bit what to do. But the aerodynamics is bringing down the aerodynamics now and being able to bridge that part. That's where the next big leap in Ironman is going to happen. It's going to be that basic aerodynamics is going to improve there, but without basically making you run slower afterwards.
Yeah.
That's a yeah.
Well, we saw recently in Ironman Texas, Cam Wurf broke the Ironman world record bike. He rode 350 something, put
Yeah.
in 200 grams of carbs an hour. We are reaching the ceiling of carbohydrate intakes, probably power, given he's a professional cyclist predominantly. So yeah, as you say, all indications are that further improvements are going to be in CDA, right? And he wasn't that much quicker than the rest of the field. So,
and I think also, just for one thing, that all respect to Cam's performance there, and bring it down to 353. It puts things a little bit into also like perspective. But we also have to remember that if you ask the rest of the field to destroy themselves equally much on the bike as well, all of them would have faster times. But it's a triathlon; you need to run off the bike afterwards. So for me, it's cool that we call it a bike record and this kind of thing, but it's also for me a little bit of distraction, because this is a triathlon where you actually are paid to run really fast off the bike afterwards while still having had a good bike time. So all respect to Cam and his impressive performance on the bike, but it's important that we don't let that become a little bit of a distraction, because most of the guys, or all of the guys, would be able to ride faster as well if they just decided, hey, I don't care about my run afterwards. I don't care if I destroy my legs. I'm just going to put out like the fastest bike split that is on the bike. Yeah. So yeah, it's
obviously riding outside is the goal, right? The race is outside. We need to be good outside. We need to be comfortable. We need to be feeling balanced, all those things. But is there a role for a significant period of training indoors to get comfortable, even if it's just from a musculoskeletal flexibility standpoint, in an aero position? Or do you think, listen, you're best off doing as much of it outside as possible if you have that ability?
When you're riding outside, you can mask a lot of the issues with the position, simply because you naturally are ending up like being forced to shuffle around a little bit on the bike, move your position, these kind of things. And you don't necessarily really know whether this is a good aerodynamic position either when you're out riding, because you don't have that kind of feedback unless you have, for example, the body rocket system on your bike. Then you can get this kind of feedback. And then I would say in this case, then practice it outdoors, and then you just, let's say, in the same way you would prescribe a session, say, hey, now you're going to do 10-minute intervals with a certain power or lactate or whatever, for those intervals. You could rather say, hey, now you're going to do these long intervals that is here, but we're going to practice, for example, a certain CDA. So we are targeting this CDA, for example, for those intervals that you have there. Mm-hmm. And that would be the best way really to practice it, because then you are in a sharp situation. But for those people that don't have that, then I think like even trying to have a mirror in front of you, and you just take a white marker and just make an outline on the mirror in front of you, something like that. And then exactly what you do is that you make sure that you sit in that position there, practice that again and again and again over time. That allows you to listen to a couple of other things that you won't necessarily equally much be able to listen to outside. And that is, for example, one is actually the variability in your pedaling stroke. So, for example, one thing when sitting on a turbo, you will normally hear this sound that is more like the. And the more of this sound you hear, this can typically be because you're rocking a little bit more, you sit more unstable on the bike. While if this sound gets a little bit smoother, we are not talking about getting a smooth sound, because that's not what you want to have either. But it's ability to judge yourself of a couple of different cues that you don't have access to in the same way outside sometimes that you would have indoors. So that's one. The second part is that if you have the mirror, you have an outline, you can exactly keep an eye there on basically, okay, how long are you able to comfortably sit in the position? Are you starting to move a little bit around the bike, which allow you to reassess also like, okay, is this a good position or not? Or even actually when you have an outline in front of you, you can actually start to see if you get comfortable getting a little bit more lower, a little bit more lower, a little bit more lower as well across a session, and then be able to compare from time to time with more stable metrics, like what really happened with my heart rate, what happened with my pedaling, did my pedaling look like sustainable? How did I perceive this session afterwards as well? Did I accumulate more fatigue, or was it less fatigue? Did I move more? Did I move less? So absolutely being able to, use a position indoors, use the turbo indoors to assess this, can be a good thing to do in combination with outdoors. But we have to remember, you're not going to win indoors. You still have to race outdoors, and that's why you also need to practice this outdoors as well. But it can be also easier to teach, because again, coming back to the example of the wind tunnel and the outline in front of you, the reason for why it's very hard, or why we use outlines in a wind tunnel or marker basically to show, okay, this was basically position, this is what you need to find every time you go back to compare helmet, suit, whatever you are looking at from run to run, is because people are not having that position naturally in your body. And to train that position naturally into your body, you actually need just to accumulate time in that position. And that's easier to do on a turbo indoors, to train that position and almost get it into like your reflexes or your bone marrow, that when you get on the bike and if you had somebody, if you didn't look at the mirror and you naturally went in and you started biking, warmed up, started biking, and a little bit after a while, that's the first time you look up and look, okay, am I inside my outline? You start to see that the more you practice it, the more naturally you get into that exact position. And that's also a challenge with the wind tunnel, is that very often, or in most cases, for a lot of athletes, put them in the wind tunnel, do air testing, find out which suit and helmet that really is good for you. Then you go out again. It probably is not the same, because you already moved more around there, that you would be better off with another suit or whatever. And that's also like one of the things we focus a lot on with Surpass as well, was not necessarily to opt for the version that we saw had the very, very best aerodynamics, but it was actually the suit that gave the most robust aerodynamics. And the interesting thing is that I think it was last year, there was an athlete that went in the wind tunnel. He tested, 5-10 different suits that were there. And it's easy to think that, well, this is a suit that has been developed for Kristian and Gustav. They are leads, they have super good position, this kind of thing. But he came out most comfortable suit and the most aero suit that he had gotten access to of all the suits that were on the market. Why? Because again, probably when you focus on robustness of the aerodynamics, it will also naturally apply to more athletes than if you focus purely on peak aerodynamics. So we could have gone out and said, hey, look, we have even better numbers for Kristian here in another suit here. But we didn't. We don't opt for that suit unless we see that it's also the suit that is the most stable one or robust one in terms of aerodynamics for them.
The Norwegian method.
The reason why you want to have a VO2 master, because when athletes or customers comes there and they are doing the training, they're putting in money and hours into improving their fitness, you want to have a device that basically allows you to track their progress, but also measuring their metabolic power as well. And then on top of that, the only way to truly be able to do individualization is also to measure the utilization of the athletes. And there is probably no better device on the market to do that with than, for example, the VO2 master.
If you've been thinking about adding VO2 testing to your training facility, you know our viewers get an exclusive one-on-one consultation with their product experts on how to make VO2 Master work for you. Head to vo2master.com/Norwegian-method to book yours today, or follow the link in our show notes.
The Norwegian method.
You could have made individual suits for the two boys, right? And then they're slightly more aero, but that's not what happened. And, that's an interesting insight, because I think people misunderstand how individual a lot of the gear that elites use. And I'm not going to say Kristian and Gustav use this stuff. It's other athletes I know as well have maybe individual shoes, individual bike setups that are not possible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's stuff that is made specifically for them, which is not available to the rest of the people. It's dialed in specifically for them. So it's interesting to hear that the tri-suit was not that way. But speaking of their bike positions, the boys, and spending time training and finding these positions, they're maybe KB more than Gustav, but their positions have changed over the years, even to my eye, right? So what's impacted this, and how did you make those decisions to decide, listen, we actually need to vary this year on year, not let's try and achieve the same position as last year?
I think naturally, since Kona, it has been really hard to work a lot on this, simply because the guys wanted to go a little bit back and forth and do different kind of racing. Like I think we talked about this a little bit before, that it became a little of a mix. But that's also why, like when we came into Ironman racing as well, we knew that by taking the approach that we had developed leading into Tokyo and beyond, that would allow us to take a step above when we have made a more of a holistic approach to it as well. Like coming back to the example of Cam, which is super impressive. Like we had the Uber bikers also 5-10 years ago. But the cool thing now is exactly that you see now that the guys that are winning the races, they are racing the same splits or even faster than the Uber bikers. And Cam just took it to another level. He is the new Uber biker now that just goes out to demonstrate, well, 4 was basically the holy grail before. Now it's maybe 350. And he is really pushing towards that part that is there. And that, of course, tells that it's not necessarily that well, most of this, obviously training is good, but also parts of this comes from aerodynamics as well. But it comes to exactly that evolution that sometimes people just have to go out and demonstrate, no, this is not the limit, we can go faster. So comparing Uber bike with Uber biker, Cam have set a new standard for how fast you can go there. Kristian, Gustav has set a new standard for how fast you can be as a triathlete, and they are racing now the faster than the Uber bikers 10 years ago, but now in position that allows them to run much faster as well than basically what we saw 10 years ago. This is going to continue. For some continued while moving forward. We have to remember Cam is a part of the team that has the fastest cyclist, or let's say our athlete in the world, Filippo Ganna. It is an iterative process. When you get more comfortable in a position, this comes back to, like I said, training this sustainability or getting it into your. I think that one thing that is a difference between when you really practice something for a long while versus when you just found a new position and it looks better and these kind of things, is that you are much more focused on your stability on the bike. Like everything that happens around you, you're more sensitive to it and you will react based on it. The more comfortable you are in a position, you don't think about it. There comes a gust, you don't reflect on it. You just continue to bike 100% natural. You don't spend a calorie on it. But it comes from training and basically training where you train on this again and again and again. It becomes super natural. But at the moment, you also are at the point where you actually thought, oh, this was a quite gusty ride today, but I actually didn't think of it. It was super stable. That's the time also when you are also probably mature to take the next step in even more aerodynamic, let's say more aerodynamic aggressive or lower CDA position as well, because you naturally have become more stable in that position that you have there. Not sure if that answers the questions.
No, that's great.
Yeah,
because that's better than answering the question. Because that's also how do you know when you're ready to change? It's not just how did you make the decisions. It's how does somebody listening know? And the answer is you get to a position, you find yourself comfortable, you can maneuver well, you feel comfortable on the bike, and then when you really feel like you're at one with that position, when it's in, as you said, when it's in your bone marrow, you won't notice gusts, you won't be weary of things like that. You won't have to come out of the aero bars because you have to make certain corners or whatever. Now maybe we can push the envelope a little bit and try a little bit more aero. And maybe it's not for racing, maybe that's for a project for next season, but certainly that's great advice, I think. So when it comes to, back onto the position stuff, KB obviously we've talked about his cramping in Milwaukee before. We talked about how you adjusted his seat at the time, the night before Singapore, to help sort of get that victory. What was a more chronic solution there? So like small adjustments on the day of, a couple of days before, like, okay, we just have to get something ready for Singapore. What was the solution, the next step from that solution of the acute solution that we mentioned previously on the podcast to a more chronic solution it's more sustainable, I guess?
I think I don't think 2023 is really a representative year for what, in this case, for example, what Kristian is capable of. Yep. Simply because it was the year after Kona, and where he wanted also to take the PTO championship as well. Went a little bit back and forth. The time we really spent on his tri bike was very, very minimal, and it was more like, okay, fine. We just try to go over to the tri bike with minimal changes, just hope that it works. And where he got penalized exactly where he had so few, I don't remember exactly, but I think he had like 1 or 2, 3 sessions on the triathlon bike. 2 sessions on the triathlon bike before Milwaukee. So you really don't get time to really exactly figure out, is this a sustainable position? So this comes just back to the weaknesses of wind tunnel testing. You really don't, you're not, you most likely naturally would change your position after wind tunnel and being riding for a couple of weeks simply because you feel that was not as good position that I thought it was. So with the learnings from Milwaukee, then you know, okay, fine, you are cramping up, so we need to ease off a little bit on I think it was the
it was saddle height or cockpit height?
Yeah. So it was saddle height we changed. So we moved the saddle backwards. Backwards a little bit. I think we back in low, a little bit lower, a little bit, which normally we think that, well, that gives a more acute angle in his position on the bike there. But what also happens at the same time, because this was a very specific problem for Kristian, it was specific muscles that it got too high load for him in Milwaukee. And by moving it back, this was basically then more balanced. So he got a more balanced load on his muscles. And that was basically it.
Yeah. It speaks to, I guess, you need to practice in this Aero position, even year on year, even if it's the same position as you had last year. And there's no substitute for that, perhaps. So I think, perhaps it's not the way I thought that question was going to go, but it's certainly a good learning nonetheless. I think to finish off, you mentioned there's a lot of CDA gains to come for triathlon, right? And or specifically Ironman and long distance triathlon. Do you have any thoughts on where they're coming? Is it going to be fairings? Is it going to be things like calf sleeves, gloves? It's going to be bottle setups, like some of the stuff we've seen already, right? We saw you guys throw the bladder down the chest. Is it that stuff, or is it complete, sort of new bike technology? Where do you think the meat is on the bone, so to speak, there?
Yeah, so where I think that the gains in aerodynamics will come moving forward is that one we see now Ironman actually starting to get converging a little bit more towards the UCI rules. They are becoming more strict on bottle placements, what the boxes that you have to stay within with different kinds of things, your setup and this kind of and so on. And I guess it is partially driven by, for example, like safety. One of the challenges when you get bottles that are basically extending too far aft of your saddle is they will see much more basically oscillating forces as well, meaning that they also are more likely to eject out of the bottle cage, which we again saw now in Texas, even for some of the riders, even bottle cages breaking and hanging off the bike there. What's the consequence of a guy coming behind you in a downhill section where you ride maybe 60, 55, or even 45 kilometers an hour for that case, which is the average pace they are holding, and he goes straight onto the bottle, falls off the bike there, simply because somebody wanted to maybe gain a couple of seconds on the Aero by doing it. So we see Ironman is converging more towards the UCI, or at least more stricter rules for what you're allowed to do. So, and also to take it from there, you can say that the big Aero gains is not going to come from your gear setup on your bike. Gear setup on your bike, that's really when you understood that, okay, I think I've exhausted my position, or what I can do on my position here, at least what I'm comfortable with in a snapshot. Going to wind tunnel, you have a position, you just do and say, okay, this is not sustainable, this is sustainable. And then what you do then you do the gear to try to optimize around it. The big thing will actually come from even more specific Aero protocols, and where you actually start to build up maybe Aero sessions where you are practicing, for example, in the same way that you can go progressive on your intervals. So you go maybe easier and then you go harder. Well, okay, that means basically what you go out is maybe you actually start to practice to go. You start off with a softer position and then you practice to get a little bit harder, more aerodynamic position towards the end of your session, for example. And then you gradually build yourself by specific targeted Aero position work, simply because the gains are large enough that you will most likely race faster for being able to do that than trying to raise your power by interval session by 2% or something like that. You will likely get more from actually building Aero interval session, you could say, where you actually vary a little bit around with a little bit easier Aero, more aggressive Aero, a little bit easier Aero. But the point is that you're looking to basically build your sessions to more time in more aerodynamics positions, getting you more comfortable, more sustainable, to the point where it is a part of your bone marrow moving forward. So gains moving forward, it will happen from change in position and more structured way of thinking of how do we practice Aero, because it's just too big of an area in Ironman racing or half Ironman racing to be overlooked and just having a generic approach to.
That's an unbelievable insight. Just like nutrition, just like training, it's going to be progressive and it's going to come, and it'll be the next frontier because, as you say, a lot of the aero gains we have seen so far are probably going to be taken away as we move back to the UCI. Because when you started the answer to that question, I was like, he's basically saying it's going to get harder, not easier. And then you talked about, but the individual is going to be more aerodynamics, not their fairings, not the bikes. It's going to be the individual on that setup. So that is an unbelievable insight. We have to end the podcast there, Olav. Appreciate you. Appreciate your time. Next podcast, the next one that people hear will be about us talking about things like how we design the triathlon suit to try and balance. And when I say we, I mean you, not me. I had nothing to do with it. But temperature and the thermodynamics of things with the things like, does it feel good on? Can we move properly? How does that affect power? How does that affect all of those sort of things as well? So that is on the next episode. And therefore, if you want to hear that and be notified of that, please do subscribe to the podcast. Of course, we'd love you to rate this and share this with somebody that you think would enjoy it. So Olav, thank you again, and we'll talk to you shortly.
Thank you, David.
The Norwegian method.